December 1944. American soldiers were dying in Belgian foxholes, not from bullets, but from cold. Tens of thousands lost to frostbite. And Patton's documented response to how his officers were treating that crisis became one of the most studied leadership moments in U.S. Army history. There's a version of the Battle of the Bulge that gets told constantly. Tanks. Bastogne. The 101st Airborne. Patton's famous 90-degree pivot. It's a story of strategic brilliance and military heroism. And all of it is true. But there's another layer to December 1944 that barely gets mentioned. A crisis that was killing American soldiers before the Germans even had a chance to. One that Patton saw with his own eyes and responded to in a way that permanently shaped how the U.S. Army thought about officer leadership. The winter of 1944 in the Ardennes was extraordinary by any historical measure. Hitler's timing of the attack was strategic. Freezing rain, thick fog, deep snowdrifts, and record-breaking low temperatures brutalized American troops. More than 15,000 cold injuries, trench foot, pneumonia, frostbite were reported that winter, and that number only tells part of the story. Casualty numbers from the cold injury epidemic in the European theater range from 46,000 to 71,000 soldiers, depending on whether only pure cold injury casualties are counted, or casualties with other medical problems and cold injury combined. Almost 90% of cold injury casualties were frontline riflemen. Think about that number. The equivalent of nearly 5 infantry divisions gone. Not from combat, from cold. Subscribe to WW2 Forgotten Frontline right now if you want the verified history that never makes it into the textbook version. The men digging into the frozen Belgian ground in December 1944 were not facing ordinary winter conditions. Soldiers often fought in zero-temperature conditions and driving snow that prevented them from seeing more than 10 or 20 yards in front of them. With equipment and uniforms designed for warmer times, frostbite became a terrible reality. Because soldiers were often cut off from their divisions in foxholes, the wounded, in some cases, literally froze to death. Private Bart Hagerman of the 17th Airborne described it simply. Both the enemy and the weather could kill you. And the two of them together was a pretty deadly combination. They couldn't light fires. Smoke gave away positions to German artillery observers. So they sat in holes in frozen ground, watching their breath crystallize in the darkness, waiting for a dawn that might bring either relief or an attack. By November 1944, the Third Army only had enough overshoes to provide them to one soldier in 4. In a survey taken at the 108th General Hospital in the first week of the Battle of the Bulge, 38% of men with cold injuries had not received overshoes at all. This wasn't a small logistical gap. This was a systemic failure. And the men paying the price for it were the ones in the ground, not the ones running the ground. Here is where the story turns into something that should be in every leadership textbook, because what happened next is fully documented in Army medical records and Patton's own letters of instruction. For the week ending November 25, 1944, for every 100 battle casualties evacuated from the 3rd U.S. Army, 60 soldiers were evacuated for cold injury. Read that again. For every 10 men going down from German fire, 6 more were going down from cold. The medical officer who delivered that information delivered it directly to Patton. Patton was already conducting the kind of surprise inspections he had built his command style around. He believed deeply, and had documented this in writing before the campaign even started, that commanders needed to see conditions themselves. Not through reports, not through scheduled briefings, by showing up unannounced and seeing what was actually happening to the men on the ground. His pre-Normandy letters of instruction to the Third Army were a compendium of his philosophy of leadership. These letters emphasize the role of the commander, who must be seen at the front, who shares the pain of battle with his soldiers. They deal with men's struggle with fear and the need for leadership presence. This wasn't a philosophy Patton wrote down and filed away. It was the standard he held himself to and the standard he expected from every officer in the Third Army. Here's the part of this story that most channels completely skip. Because the most powerful thing Patton did in December 1944 wasn't a single dramatic confrontation. It was a documented system of accountability he had built into the Third Army before the battle even started. The letters of instruction were explicit. Officers were expected to be forward, to share conditions with the men they commanded, to understand, through physical presence rather than written reports, what their soldiers were actually experiencing. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a command philosophy backed by Patton's well-documented willingness to relieve officers who failed to meet it. These letters share Patton's professional thought with his subordinate commanders in pithy comments retained as a list of battle proverbs, emphasizing the role of the commander, who must be seen at the front, who shares the pain of battle with his soldiers. That phrase, shares the pain of battle, was the foundation of how Patton expected the officer corps to function. Not as administrators behind the lines, as leaders whose presence at the point of hardship was itself a source of fighting strength for the men around them. When the cold injury numbers started climbing, when 60 non-combat evacuations were happening for every 100 combat evacuations, Patton understood what that data meant at the human level. Officers weren't close enough to their men. They weren't seeing the frostbite developing. They weren't catching it early enough. The physical distance between commanders and the men in foxholes was costing the Third Army fighting strength it couldn't afford to lose. Like this video if you've learned something you didn't know before. And subscribe, because this level of depth is what WW2 Forgotten Frontline does every single week. To understand why Patton's leadership standard in December 1944 was so remarkable, you have to understand what he was asking the entire Third Army to do simultaneously. On December 19, 1944, 3 days after the Germans launched their counteroffensive, Eisenhower met with key generals in Verdun. Patton claimed he would be ready to attack north by December 21. Eisenhower thought the timeline was impossible. Eisenhower accused him of being fatuous and worried that Patton would attack before he had a large enough force. Patton moved anyway and delivered. Eisenhower gave Patton the Third Army, about 230,000 soldiers, and ordered him to head to the Ardennes. The day after Christmas, units of Patton's rapidly approaching Third Army arrived, broke through the German lines, and rescued the troops defending Bastogne, redirecting 250,000 men in hundreds of armored vehicles 90 degrees in 48 hours, in sub-zero temperatures, through icy Belgian roads, while simultaneously managing an epidemic of cold injuries that was draining frontline strength. This was the operational reality Patton was living inside, and in the middle of all of it, he was still demanding that his officers be present. Forward, cold, with their men. That's not incidental. That's the point. The standard Patton held wasn't separate from the military mission, it was part of what made the mission possible. An officer who understood his soldiers' conditions from inside those conditions could make faster, better decisions than an officer reading about those conditions from a warm room miles away. Here's what the documented record shows about how this standard played out across the Third Army in December 1944. Trench foot was more common than combat wounds during the Bulge. Soldiers spent days in frozen foxholes with wet boots. Their feet went numb then turned black. Medics inspected feet constantly, but the sheer number of cases overwhelmed treatment capacity. The 77th Evacuation Hospital had beds for 750 patients. During the battle, it handled twice that number. The officers who were physically present with their units caught these cases earlier. They could see a soldier limping. They could order rotation of men out of wet positions. They could push for the resupply of dry socks which Patton had specifically ordered distributed across the Third Army as a direct response to the cold injury epidemic. The officers who weren't present couldn't do any of that. They were managing the crisis through paperwork, not through presence. Patton understood this distinction completely. His surprise inspections weren't theater. They were a command mechanism, a way of detecting, in real time, which officers were living the standard, and which ones were managing it from a distance. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945. It proved to be the costliest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army, which suffered over 100,000 casualties. Of those, a documented and staggering proportion were cold injuries, preventable losses tied directly to the gap between officer comfort and frontline reality. The Army studied this in depth. The cold injury epidemic of 1944-45 drove a complete overhaul of how the U.S. military prepared for winter warfare. The 15,000 non-battle casualties suffered during the Bulge led to a radical reevaluation of how the U.S. military prepares for the elements. Today, NATO's cold weather doctrines are built on the Ardennes lessons. But the leadership lesson embedded in Patton's letters of instruction survived longer than any equipment change. The principle that officers are present with their soldiers, that rank is a burden carried forward, not a privilege accumulated in the rear, became a foundational element of U.S. Army doctrine that is still taught at West Point and the Army War College today. Patton didn't discover this principle in December 1944. He had been writing about it, teaching it, and enforcing it for his entire career. What December 1944 did was test that standard at its absolute limit, and the documented record shows that the officers who met it held their units together through one of the most brutal winter campaigns in American military history. Here's the question this story leaves us with. And it's not just about World War II. Every institution, military, corporate, political, creates conditions where rank can mean distance, where the people at the top experience the organization differently from the people doing the hardest work. The gap between that comfort and that hardship almost always costs more than the people at the top realize in morale, in trust, in the quality of decisions made without accurate ground-level information. Patton's documented answer to that problem was elegant in its simplicity. You cannot lead people effectively through an experience you are not willing to share. The officer who is cold alongside his soldiers doesn't just earn their respect, he makes better decisions, because he is making them from inside the reality his soldiers live in, not from outside it. That's what the letters of instruction said. That's what the Third Army's surprise inspections enforced. And that's what the cold injury data from December 1944 proved, in the most unforgiving possible way, when that standard wasn't met. Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne in 48 hours. They did it in sub-zero temperatures, through icy roads, against a German offensive that had shattered 2 American corps. They did it because the standard of leadership present with the men, sharing the conditions of the men, had been built into the culture of that army from the moment Patton took command. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Does this change how you think about leadership in any context? And if verified, documented WW2 history told at this depth is what you've been looking for, subscribe to WW2 Forgotten Frontline right now and hit the notification bell. We post every week. We never cut corners on the sources. And the history is always better than the legend.